We don't understand what is going on in physics. And clearly at the level of microbiology and cell biology, we don't really understand what's going on. People are mixing things in test tubes. And that's another important point. A lot of what goes on in cell biology, this is happening in a lab, whereas what happens in a human body might be very different in a much more complex environment with all the different variables in the human body. And they're trying to extrapolate based on things in test tubes. There's just so many problems with the way modern science and just modern society is working and not acknowledging all of the pitfalls.
So Mark, welcome to the show. And I've followed your work for a long time, and I absolutely love the way you apply thinking to a lot of beliefs which people don't question. And I think now more than ever we have a issue with making sense of reality and what to trust and who to trust. But ultimately, from my perspective, it comes back to developing skills within ourselves that we can become the place of origin to make sense of reality through many different aspects of intuition, but also most importantly, using our mind to make sense of reality in a structured sense. Before we dive into that, do you want to just give a quick, for people who've never heard of you and you meet someone, how do you describe what you do?
I would say now I am someone who's very curious in understanding the nature of reality, who we are, why we're here, what's going on in the world. And that's not where I really came from. I grew up just wanting to achieve and to win. So I was a competitive tennis player, and then I went to Princeton University for my undergrad, worked in investment banking in New York during the financial crisis of 2008, and then spent a bunch of time in Silicon Valley advising technology-focused companies. My shift away from that world started in 2016, where I started to ask these questions. I was listening to podcasts initially that exposed me to ideas about the nature of consciousness and the human mind and the possibility of an afterlife and things like that, which I had not really heard about in any serious way until 2016. And it's propelled me on this journey, which has now culminated in 7 books so far, a podcast series. It's an 8-episode series called Where Is My Mind? And I actually ended up leaving my job, which I had spent 10 years there and had become a partner at the firm. But at the end of 19 and early 2020, at that point, I'd only written 1 book and had my podcast series. I just felt like I needed to give myself space and not be in that mode anymore. So since leaving the job, I've written many more books and have continued to look at areas that I was not looking at initially, because I started in the field of consciousness and spiritual awakening, so to speak. Then it moved into politics and the dark and light forces in the world, UFOs, the direction of society, the World Economic Forum, medicine, cosmology, lots of topics that I did not anticipate considering early on.
Just the small topics. Just sort of the unimportant ones. You pretty much, with all your books, you've covered the scope of humanity and the problems which we face, ostensibly. But what I love is, look, I think we all operate it's very difficult obviously to define what objective reality is, indeed consciousness and reality itself. That is I'm not sure if we'll ever unravel that as a species. Who knows? But we operate in this 3D reality very much on assumptions based on and this is what I love about your work, questioning the foundations of these assumptions, which are just implicit in our everyday life. It comes with, medicine, the potentials of human beings and what they have, what capabilities which we all have innate within us. And often when these things are brought up until very recently, they've been instantly criticized as quackery, or you're a conspiracy theorist, or you're not more than any reality. And you go through very methodically and pull away a lot of these shaky foundations to which all of a reality is based on. So I guess before we dive into that, how would you categorize the way you've gotten to this point of how you think about things and make clarity of instead of just adopting an authority's viewpoint on this is the way it is and this is the way it's always been? How do you apply the skills that you have to disentangle falsity from truth or potential from fakeness?
Well, one general thing I've done is that I've looked outside of the mainstream narrative. And I've learned that there's so much information, often very good information, and even good science and peer reviewed papers that is not within the mainstream narrative. So I realized that there was a whole body of information that could be assessed that many people are not being exposed to. And I thought I had a pretty good education, that I had a good pulse of what was going on in the world, being in New York and Silicon Valley, and knew so many smart people. And I've continually been exposed to things that those communities don't even know exists most of the time. And then there are some areas of logic that I want to talk about, but this notion of basically an information asymmetry, that's what it comes down to. Because in many cases, if people simply knew that certain information existed, they might shift their views, but they don't know it exists. And then because they've developed such a narrow worldview, it's harder and harder to accept that information, because they'll say, well, that doesn't really conform to what I believe, so it can't be true. I'll give you one example in the political realm that just happened yesterday. On Truth Social, which is one of the, a Twitter competitor, Donald Trump posted that he had a conversation with Vladimir Putin from Russia, and had a detailed, he detailed what this conversation looked like. And I know that's this is triggering for some people, but I'm just saying what happened. I went on MSNBC.com.
Don't do that.
I wanted to see what they said about it. Nothing. I mean, you'd think that that would be a top story, exactly what the president of the United States was saying to the leader of Russia, and it wasn't even there. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to just literally copy his post from Truth Social. It was maybe a few sentences. It was a paragraph, basically, and nothing was there. So that is emblematic of the way in which people who are well-meaning and think they're being educated, if they're not looking outside of their traditional sources, they might be blindsided as to what's really happening in the world, and they can actually be brainwashed and given a false reality that is extremely limited and biased. So that's one example of just this information asymmetry that's really critical. I've been much more interested in learning about things that they're not being presented in academia or in the media, for example, but also might be credible. That's one. But then there are also areas of just logic and reasoning that I'm coming across more and more, where people will dismiss things, or they're unable to process something because of an error in thinking. One that I am talking about a lot these days, it's called affirming the consequence, a logical fallacy. Basically, it goes like this. Statement one, which is true. Statement one is, if it rained, the grass outside will be wet. No real argument there. The second statement, this is where we run into a fallacy. I see that the grass outside is wet, and therefore I conclude that it rained. Ooh, why is that a problem? Because the first sentence says that rain will cause wet grass. But if we see wet grass, can we assume that rain caused it? Not necessarily, because there are a million other reasons that grass could be wet, like dew and sprinkler systems and children running by and pouring buckets of water on the grass, or maybe even areas of science and biology that we don't understand that can cause the phenomenon. So the error people run into is concluding that because a model of reality can accurately explain an observation, that model of reality is correct. Rather than saying, well, what other models of reality could explain those things that we observe that also might work? And the problem that happens, and this is not just in science and cosmology and medicine, but in politics and economics, people observe something, they jump onto a causal model that could work, like it rained, rain would explain wet grass, and then they build an entire worldview around the idea that it rained last night, and any new observations are force-fit into the model that it rained last night, ignoring all the other possibilities. And then we get into this narrow-minded view of it rained last night, and all the research and funding is going toward that, and the media is talking about how it rained last night. And meanwhile, we might be totally off track. I cannot emphasize this enough. A model that can accurately explain something isn't necessarily the correct model. We jump to causal explanations too often. Go ahead.
I was also going to say, on a deeper level of our tribal roots as well, I see a lot of people who are, as we've seen almost in every sphere, particularly exacerbated due to COVID, that people are so identified with the ideological bent. So their entire personality structure is based around this tribal foundation, and they don't even see it. They just think they're observing objective truth, when in actual they're just adhering to an ideology, and their identity is fed by that. So when it comes to actually seeking truth and really seeking truth, you've got to, not only is that difficult enough in and of itself, it's becomes almost impossible when you have to deconstruct the idea of what you thought your personality was. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the maybe broader meta lesson here is that there needs to be a willingness always for us to question our assumptions about everything, about the world around us, but also our own internal beliefs about ourselves. I think this is fundamental, because then we're more able to be malleable and not get fixed into one belief system and not get stuck into this tribalism. So what I've started to adopt more and more is that if I have a general belief, or more specifically, if I'm told something is true by anyone, my question is, how could we verify that that thing is true? What are the assumptions underlying this thing that we're told is true? And what I continue to find in these various disciplines is that often beliefs are based on extremely shaky foundations, and those shaky foundations are not acknowledged. I can't emphasize that enough. We're told something, we're told it's true because of X, Y, and Z, and have we evaluated X, Y, and Z to see if that actually holds up? One of the problems here is that it can take digging, it can take a lot of time and energy to do this, to approach life with this sort of thinking. But in the end, I do think it's fruitful, because it leads us away from a lot of brainwashing. And the more that I've looked into this, the more I realize that our society seems to be based on shaky foundations. So it is difficult to trust anything at face value without really asking. And that can be uncomfortable for people, to live in a world where there's so little to trust. It's easier just to say, well, I want to trust it. But I'm finding that that's actually not a safe way to go, because we can all be misled into unsafe patterns if we don't ask these questions.
What's for you one of the most shocking examples of what you just mentioned about assumptions that are based on absolutely on sand, that most people would believe? What was, when you first started down this path of all the books, what's one of your biggest moments of, oh my God?
Yeah, the first one was about consciousness and the brain. So consciousness could be regarded as our subjective inner awareness, the part of us that experiences. It's difficult to define because I can't point to it, we can't touch it, but everyone listening to this right now is listening in their consciousness. So we're all conscious. It's super fundamental. The question is, where does that come from? And I didn't even know that was a question until a number of years ago, because I just assumed it comes from the brain, obviously, because we have a whole field of neuroscience that shows these correlations. If you affect the brain this way, your conscious experience changes. And it's the same affirming the consequent problem of, if the brain created consciousness, then we would see tight correlations between brain activity and conscious experience. Second statement, we observe tight correlations between brain activity and conscious experience. Therefore, the brain created consciousness. Are there other ways to look at it? Another example is, if you have a fire and firefighters show up, do you conclude that because these two are correlated, that firefighters caused the fire? Or are the firefighters having some other relationship with the fire? Same thing. So what I started to look at is, well, maybe the brain is involved in our conscious experience, but it's like an antenna, or it's like a filtering mechanism or an interface where our consciousness is way beyond the body, and there's almost like a soul, and the body is a vehicle and a vessel. That's a whole other hypothesis that could explain why there are correlations between brain activity and conscious experience. In the same way that if you smash the antenna on your television set, the TV show is going to appear scratchy on the screen, but it's not because the signal was damaged. The only thing that was damaged was the apparatus, the antenna, that was processing the signal. It's a very similar thing. I can give you another one that's a little bit more recent, because that paradigm shift for me started in 2016, and it was in my book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, published in 2018. But my book on medicine, An End to Upside Down Medicine, was published at the end of 2023. And I never really thought, prior to researching that book, to question the germ theory of disease. And the germ theory of disease is that there exist microbes that cause disease in healthy people. We know, for example, that like bacteria, if you have a quote unquote infection, there are lots of bacteria that are associated with sickness and symptoms that could be very painful. The question is, did the bacteria fundamentally cause the disease, or are the bacteria there because there's an underlying toxicity that they're helping to clear?
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
It's a very big difference.
You still might need to use antibiotics if there are too many of them, but the question here is about causality. Do the bacteria fundamentally cause the disease, or are they helpers, like a cleanup crew? That was a big one for me. I had never really thought about that before. And we could say the same thing about fungi and parasites, because those are usually demonized as bad things. Well, maybe they just co-occur because there's an underlying problem that they are uniquely qualified to help clean up. Just an idea. But even more fundamentally, when we're talking about germ theory, the existence of a virus was something I didn't know was in question, especially given everything that happened starting in 2020, where there was an alleged virus that was the reason for shutting down society and then for creating an injection based on the belief in that virus. How could virus not be there? That sounds too outlandish. And that was certainly what I kind of thought when I heard people talk about it. And then I realized that they were getting into some very interesting territory with regard to the methodologies used with viruses. And I've asked doctors about this. If you ask a doctor, how is it known that a virus exists and causes disease? Like, what are the methods that are used? And often they give indirect answers like, oh, there's a PCR test that detects the virus. Well, what is the PCR test? How was that designed? And so forth. And what I realize is that many people are not aware of the history of virology, which basically starts with the idea that the Greek word eos is where the word virus comes from, and it's referring to some kind of a poison. And then Louis Pasteur in the 1800s was looking at rabies, for example, and he saw symptoms in dogs, and someone would get bitten and they would have symptoms, and he couldn't find a transmissible agent. He couldn't see something that was found, in one that went to the other, and he just assumed it must be too small that I actually can't isolate this transmissible agent, but it must be there. And at the time, there was no electron microscope, and you need an electron microscope to see anything as small as a virus is believed to be. So that we can fast forward to the 1950s, when Watson and Crick in 1953 came out with their double helix structure of DNA. So now there was room for, maybe there's a genetic parasite. Because previously they were trying to understand what's the mechanism for disease in all these cases. Is it a poison? Is there a transmissible agent? Now we had genetics, so there was an ability to think about a genetic parasite, which is what a virus now is believed to be. Basically, this replication-competent intracellular parasite gets inside of a host cell, replicates, goes out into other host cells and causes disease, and then goes from one person to another person. It's a very specific definition of a virus. So then that leads us to 1954, which is where we get into the logical fallacies again. Enders and Peebles, a famous study now because it has become the gold standard for quote-unquote virus isolation. And Enders actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on something else. So this was a very prominent guy. The methodology that they developed in order to allegedly isolate a virus was to take fluids from someone who was sick. In this case, someone who had symptoms that you would call measles. And they assumed that there was a virus in the sample from the sick person, and they put those fluids into a soup of material. It's called a cell culture. And this soup has a lot of different stuff in it, like antibiotics and monkey kidney cells and a whole litany of other things. What the scientists found was that when you add fluids from a sick person and put it into the cell culture, sometimes the cells in the cell culture break down. And they conclude that a virus must have been there to cause the cells to break down. Again, it's affirming the consequent. It's true that if we believed in a virus and if that were real and if it existed in the fluids from a sick person, it could cause cells to break down in the cell culture. But there are a million other explanations. What if there's other cellular material, non-viral cellular material in a person who's sick that causes cells to break down? What if you didn't even add fluids from a sick person and just the antibiotics and the other stuff causes cells to break down? And actually there are control studies, quote unquote control studies by Jamie Andrews in the UK, and they're looking at this where the cell culture by itself can cause cells to break down. Stefan Lanka, who was a classically trained virologist, he added yeast RNA to the cell culture, no alleged virus, and cells broke down. So we have this method that they assume they have isolated a virus, and what have they really done? They have co-opted and hijacked the term isolation. Because isolation means to separate one thing from other things. It doesn't mean this indirect thing of, well, we're just presupposing a virus is in there and that's why we see the cells breaking down. It's known as a cytopathic effect. They see a cytopathic effect and they assume a virus did it. So we're in some really shaky territory, because if you wanted to run science, you need to have an independent variable and proper controls. An independent variable is the thing you add into the experiment to see if there's an effect. So in this case, you'd want to have a virus by itself and then add it to the cell culture and see, but they don't do that.
I didn't know
So
that. You're kidding me. So they're
this,
they're breaking their number one rule for what they claim is the gold standard of science, which the whole medical institution is based on. I
yes.
mean, in terms of virus, I'm not talking about the
Yes. Well summarized. That's what it is. So Dr. Tom Cowan, who's a classically trained medical doctor who's been speaking out against virology, also Dr. Andrew Kaufman, Doctors Mark and Sam Bailey in New Zealand, Michael Yeadon, who is a former VP at Pfizer, has recently been commenting that he agrees with this sort of thing. So it's gaining momentum. But what Dr. Cowan said is that if you wanted to isolate a hammer from a toolbox, you take the hammer out of the toolbox, and then you could study the hammer and you could characterize it. You could do all sorts of tests on it. That would be isolating the hammer. That's not what they do in these studies. They don't isolate it. They call it isolation, so it sounds nice and it sounds like they have an independent variable, but they actually don't. Because members of your audience can go online and you could search isolation of the measles virus, isolation of SARS-CoV-2. You will find papers in the title. It says we've isolated the virus. But really, you need to go to the methodology section to see the methods that they used, and you'll find that they were not actually isolating it. And they'll often say we filtered the sample from a sick person, but it's not a truly purified sample of just a virus by itself. There's always a little bit of other stuff in there, even if you filter it. So what's happened now is that Christine Massey, who's based in Canada, along with her colleagues, have started to submit freedom of information requests to health organizations all over the world, including the CDC and many other places, asking this very question: can you please send me records of a purified sample of SARS-CoV-2 or any other one you can imagine? Please do it for me. And I'm not talking about isolation using a cell culture. I'm talking about a purified sample. And what do they say? They say we have no records of this.
Don't have it. What a surprise.
And in one case, a health organization in Canada actually said the gold standard in virology is to use cell culture. So, of course, we don't have any results for you. And this is a house of cards.
I'm just letting it all sink in, because I've researched this a bit myself, but you've just articulated and gone more in depth in terms of something just clicked with me. And it's, you sort of have an idea that these, particularly during COVID, it was, if you had some sort of, I had an instant emotional reaction or intuition that this doesn't feel right. It just didn't feel right in my bones. It feels rushed. It's insane. And I'm seeing the manipulation of the public through propaganda and the segmenting of people. Anyone who disagreed with the dominant narrative is now, conspiracy theorist or purposely trying to kill your grandmother or all this stuff. It was so, but I mean, because I was, just a bit of an overview. I was in Melbourne in Australia, which was the most locked down city on earth. So I personally, and I had a business which was shut down. I lost a lot of money. I had a very personal interaction with what happened. Intimate, sorry, I should say. And so, yeah, that's when you start looking into it, when you phrase it like that, it's like, how on earth did we get here? That's insane. It makes me think, it's that great quote, never expect a man to understand something when his salary depends on it, not understanding it. And so that's a bit more, I guess, gives a bit more leeway to thinking maybe people are naively going along with this, or they do have good intentions but don't understand that the foundation is built on sand. Or I can go down the pathway of, do you think we just have these nefarious overlords who are purposely leading us down the wrong path to make profit? Because it's insane, the malpractice that you just outlined.
I think it's a little bit of both. And my guess is that most people don't realize what we just have discussed. They have just assumed that these studies were done properly, and they read the paper that says isolation, and this is the gold standard. They're not going to ask questions. It's very risky to ask questions. I mean, Stefan Lanka it's not been good for his career in many ways. He's the classically trained virologist. To go against the grain like that, you're challenging massive industries. But there must be some people who know, and I don't know who or how or what, But think about what this means. If there are no germs that cause disease, let's say if that's true, then why would you even need an injection protecting you against those things? Think about what that industry is, how big it is. So what we're questioning here goes against some very big forces. So there will be reasons to keep it quiet. But I want to emphasize a few things here because if your audience is hearing this for the first time, there can be like some knee-jerk reactions that I had myself too. The claim here is not, we're not saying people don't get sick. The question is, why do they get sick? Is it because of this little particle that's getting inside your cells and spreading from person to person? Or are there other reasons people get sick, like toxicity in the environment? Like if you go to a party and a bunch of people get sick, it's not necessarily because you caught something from another person. It could be that there were toxins in the room, food poisoning, electromagnetic issues. There could even be energetic resonances that we don't understand, psychological factors and traumas or resolving conflicts like in germ and new medicine. The point there's a lot. And then a few other things your audience might be wondering about is, well, Mark, there are antiviral drugs and there's genetic sequencing and there's the spike protein. How do we reconcile all of this? And basically, anytime the word viral or virus is used, we have to treat it differently now. We have to treat it as a mythical creature that has never been established. The technical term is the reification fallacy. It's referring to something that's really an abstraction that might not even exist as if it's real. And by saying it over and over again, you reinforce its existence or its apparent existence. So let's take antiviral drugs, for example. What is the presupposition in that term? The presupposition is that the drug was designed specifically to stop symptoms that are caused by a virus. Question is, what if it has a more general way of functioning such that it reduces symptoms, but not because it's stopping a virus? In the same way that chemotherapy is just like a general shotgun approach.
It's just blocking. Could just making it worse by blocking symptoms or, sorry, go on.
Yes, exactly. As it's like an anti-metabolite, for example.
Yeah.
It could be, so the term antiviral is actually a misnomer, or an antigen test or an antibody test to say this is a viral antigen or a viral antibody. These just might be things that are commonly associated with people who have similar symptoms that have nothing to do with a virus. That maybe these are things found in samples that have similar illness, or there are a million things it could be, but we haven't established the virus first. And think about genetic sequences. If you're sequencing something, you'd want to have just that thing in the sample in order to know what these genetic fragments really are. But if you're working from an unpurified sample, how do you know that the fragments are viral in nature? As Dr. Mark Bailey says, you're looking at genetic fragments of unknown provenance. So yeah, they might be doing a bunch of crazy stuff in a computer, but you don't know that it's necessarily viral if you haven't found the virus first. So this is the foundation, and everything else off of that is a big problem. And I should mention that in the Enders and Peebles study from 1954, they even acknowledged that there could be quote unquote unknown factors that are causing the cells to break down that have nothing to do with the virus, in other words. So they even acknowledge this, and yet it has become the gold standard, and you're not allowed to question it. You get called all sorts of names, but we really need to be questioning it if we want to understand why people get sick, and if we want to avoid potential tyranny around these injections or other medical practices where they say you need to have this social distancing or stay in your apartment, or you need to have this injection in order to travel, based on shaky foundations, based on a reification fallacy, a mythical creature that's never been shown to exist, like a unicorn. And some people would say, I've actually done a lot of sparring with AI on this, like ChatGPT and everything. And if your audience is interested, on my social media, I post some of my conversations, and I get it to admit some of this stuff eventually.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's amazing, isn't it? When you keep it does actually end up. Yeah. So go on.
But you have to be persistent. If you ask,
you've got to be very persistent. Yeah.
If you ask it, it will give you consensus responses without the proper prompting. But one like sort of analog to this is to say, if you saw a footprint, because AI will like to defend, and they'll say there are multitudes of evidence, Mark, and there's so much indirect evidence, we have to trust this. So it's like if you saw a tiger footprint in the ground, you could infer that the tiger was there. It's indirect evidence. The problem is that these sorts of analogies don't work, because in the tiger example, we have isolated a tiger. We have been able to characterize what a tiger looks like and what a paw print would look like. And we could then more reasonably make an inference that this looks just like a tiger print, has specific things, because we've identified a tiger first. The problem with the virus issue is we haven't established what a virus is, and therefore we can't know its footprint or its genetic sequence or and so forth. And one more thing I want to add to this that I didn't know about when I was writing the book, because Dr. Tom Cowan has been starting to question the fundamentals of genetics. He did a webinar on this and also did a podcast with Alex Zeck on the way forward. And I think this is an area we should all be looking at. And the question is not like, is there heredity of inherited things? The question is, what is the mechanism for that? Yeah. Is DNA the correct way of looking at it? And I know people have been asking, I don't know as much about this stuff, but people are questioning whether the nucleotide has been isolated properly. But this other thing that that seems to be true is that there is no organism for which we have a 100% fully fleshed out genome. There are always these little gaps, even the human genome.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it, I'm like, this is a really big problem for all of molecular biology, but really for viruses in particular, because a virus is so heavily defined by its genetic sequence. It's a protein encased parasite that has a bunch of genetic stuff in it that is a genetic parasite. But if we don't have a full genome for any virus, even if they claim they have a largely flushed out genome, that is a problem that needs to be looked at even more closely.
I'm suppressing anger and just disbelief at the same time, because if you were to, because I've been in business, and if you run a business and you say you've got a warehouse and stock is going missing, and you think you have a full idea and you've done your inventory and you think you know where all the stock is, but there's 3% of that which is unclear, and that 3% might be someone who's created a hole in a wall and is passing it to a van at the back due to a untrustworthy employee. Your whole model is broken on, and if you're just assuming that is unknowable, then you're going to have this. Your foundation doesn't exist. You're going to have this ongoing issue where you can't see the truth of what's happening and you can't ever fix it. That's the thing, you can never fix it because you don't know. So. Yeah. It's how are such supposedly intelligent people rolling with a faulty assumption to begin with? It's just like, what wouldn't your position then be? We know this much, and given that we know this much, we're doing what we can with what we know, but we need to ascertain, we need to be very clear with you from the beginning that this is the limitations of our current knowledge base.
People get locked into a paradigm, and then they end up making inferences that are inappropriate. I'll give you one example. We haven't talked about electron microscope images yet, because maybe some members of your audience that go online and they see a picture from a microscope of a virus, and they're like, what are you guys talking about, Mark and Paul? There's actually a picture of a virus. The question is, what is the sample from which they're taking that picture? It's always an unpurified sample because they've never purified just a virus by itself. So there's all sorts of other things that they could be looking at. And there are papers that I reference in my book and into Upside Down Medicine where there are known examples of misinterpreting electron microscope images, where one thing that should have been SARS-CoV-2 actually looks like a kidney cell, for example, in another case. So there's ways of misinterpreting these things. But even more fundamentally, a virus is supposed to be something that's living and moving around, getting inside the host cell, basic. Yeah. Jumping from one person to the next. And what do we see in an electron microscope image? That's not the way it works. They have to, in order to get this to get a sample that you can look at under the microscope, you have to slice it up. You're looking at something dead and static rather than alive and moving. So you end up making extrapolations. And I've heard some cases where defenders of the virus paradigm will look at an electron microscope image and say, oh, this is the virus budding out of the cell. And that's what a virus does. So they look at something still and they extrapolate something based on their prior belief. They're stuck in the model that it rained last night, so they're going to interpret their data to fit that. And you can end up reinforcing all of these things, and you end up with the reification fallacy. You say these things enough, and you've created an entire industry, basically, sometimes innocently. And I think there is a bit of that.
So I was going to say on that, because, particularly with the universities and funding, that if you do go against your professors or the current paradigm, then you're not going to get any funding, and you won't get any, there's no way you're ever going to progress in your career in that industry.
You could be looking at no more paychecks, and for people who need to feed their families, this is very serious. I've seen this up close and personal in the space of consciousness, which is where I started. People who study near-death experiences or psychic phenomena like telepathy and precognition, who will have to leave academia because you can't talk about this. And I know one woman, for example, she was told at a major US university to take her research that she was doing on precognition off her resume if she wanted to get tenure. It's really serious. That's just one example out of many that I could give you where there is institutional pressure against studying or speaking about these things. So this is what happens everywhere where there's an entrenched paradigm. Don't question it. Same thing in cosmology. Same thing even in economics. I mean, I've written about the Austrian School of Economics, which is a type of free market capitalism,
Mm.
and amazing talking to people in that space, professors of economics who basically have to like hide what they do or find little pockets where they're able to speak freely. There is a paradigm that has been imposed on us in
Mm.
various areas. It's like multiple tentacles that go into these different disciplines. There's one narrative to follow, and if you depart from that, it is actually dangerous for you.
Mm. Isn't it the case that often these assumptions in particularly in science don't actually change until the current oligarchs who are ruling over it die? Like it takes, so we might have known about the new paradigm or new possibilities within a field for 60 years, but the line has been held by people whose reputations and careers depend on it staying the same.
Absolutely. I think there are two basic branches to look at. One is intentional social engineering, and that's
Mm.
going to continue regardless of generation. So there's an element of that. And then there is the ego defense of, well, I'm a tenured professor and I have my PhD and I've been speaking for my whole career. I'm 80 years old,
Mm.
and no one's going to challenge my paradigm because I'm going to defend my ego, generally speaking.
Mm.
So there are these various pressures that keep academia in a very unscientific state, which is ironic because it's supposed
Mm.
to be one of questioning, and apparently you're not allowed to question these things. And it's quite amazing to see the so-called immune response when people are encounter this alternative material. And I've had to face this personally when I'm challenging consciousness or medicine. Like people's antibodies start to activate, and they're like
Mm.
they start to freak out, and they almost can't and don't want to look at these other possibilities. And in some cases, they even get angry and say that this is what you're doing is dangerous. So
Mm.
I feel like I've personally seen so much of this, and it actually explains to me why we're so locked in paradigms that might be false.
It is crazy though, because if you look at particularly with all these extra abilities with consciousness that we have, that we in the wider public are ignored, or as you said, within the current paradigm of consciousness and consciousness studies, are dismissed, and in fact dismissed with a lot of vitriol. I had Stefan Swartz on, who's one of the predominant research, as with remote viewing. And if
Mm-hmm.
you look at the way he's conducted, and he's done this for, God, 45 years, and the way he's conducted his research, the methodical approach, you can't fault the way he's structured the research. And I think he said with the precognition, up to 80% accuracy in foretelling the future, and a whole bunch of other things. So obviously, I asked him about my crypto portfolio if he can do one. But it's just like people think it's woo woo, and it's like no, it's not woo at all. With the precognition, it's so well studied. It's probably got, as you said in your book, it's got more scientific backing and validity around it than many of these other things which we take for granted don't. And it's amazing that how easily influenced we are, because the bigger bully, the bigger body of the guy in the white coat who's got Harvard Medical School behind him says it doesn't exist. So of course it mustn't exist.
Yeah, well, to add on to that, it's not just the academics, but it's the institution of peer-reviewed journals, for example, that
Mm.
won't look at certain studies because of the implications of what's discussed in the studies. So they'll reject papers on the
Yeah.
basis of the subject matter, not because the science was bad. Unfortunately, there's been enough studies submitted that we do have more and more peer-reviewed research, and I'm on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which
Yep.
anyone can go to their website and look at all the peer-reviewed publications. But
Mm.
it's been really hard to get to this point, and it's still not perfect. Certain things that mainstream outlets will not look at. So it's like from every angle, these pressures exist, but the truth is getting out. And you mentioned Stefan Schwartz and remote viewing research. I also interviewed him for my podcast series,
Mm.
Where is
Oh,
My Mind, several years
yeah.
ago. And there is, to me, hardcore evidence of remote viewing coming from
Oh, yeah.
declassified CIA
CIA
documents.
documents. Yeah, I mean, it's the CIA did it successfully to find Russian sites. So are they a bunch of crazy out there acid taking woo woo art?
I mean, these documents, and I include them in my book, Remote
Yeah.
viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. Direct quotes from the CIA declassified documents.
Hmm. It's, I don't know if, do you know a guy, my mind comes, it's because I said Stefan, I think it's Stephen Jenkinson. God, I hope I got that right. He's done, I don't know if you know his work, he's done a lot of work on death and dying,
Mm.
helping people in palliative care. And he's just got a very, I'll send you some. He's got just a absolute wordsmith, and he's got what I love about him, and similar to your work, it's more about just asking questions and how can I
Mm-hmm.
formulate better questions to understand reality rather than just, okay, here's a question, here's the answer, done, great. Now let's get on with my life based on that rather bad question. But and this pertains to consciousness. It's a very new phenomena in evolutionary biology that we have come to assume that consciousness manifests from the mind. Up until, previous ancient cultures have all said that consciousness is in some sort of ether, and it's a lot broader and larger than we can imagine. And that the problem with modernity and what we face now is that we are completely bereft of eldership, and we lack any connection to our ancestors. We don't have a respect, and you've seen this with wokeness culture and so on. We have zero respect for the sacrifices that previous generations have made for us to even ask these questions. And
Mm-hmm.
it makes me really emotional because I have family members who died in wars and they literally sacrificed their entire life without a thought for themselves for generations to come. And now we have people on, iPhones getting outraged because someone mispronounced them. And I'm like, and you're calling other people privileged. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on in your mind? Like you are the most ungrateful, solipsistic, narcissistic, your behavior pattern. Sorry, not your soul, but like you're presenting as the very thing that you're accusing others of in the extreme. And I kind of feel if we had a bit more breadth of appreciation and understanding of all these millennia to where we are now, we could actually ask better questions. Because we just assume that we're so arrogant to think that we know everything now on this point in time when we know nothing really, particularly when it pertains to consciousness.
It's the absolute truth that we know so little. I mean, let's go back to viruses for a second. We're told that there is this particle that goes inside the cells and then goes from one person to another. No one has ever seen that happen. I mean, how many other things exist where we actually haven't seen the thing occur that we believe? Going to cosmology for a quick second, the mainstream cosmological belief says that we only understand 4% of the universe, and the rest, 96% roughly,
Mm,
is dark matter
dark
and
matter.
dark energy. Meaning, this is stuff that might not even exist. They just assume it must be there in order to fill in the gap for all the things we don't understand. And on top of that, mainstream physics will acknowledge we do not have a unified theory of physics that can reconcile the two leading theories, which have their own problems, by the way, on their own. But Einstein's relativity and quantum mechanics, which are staples of modern physics, they don't work when they're put together. Metaphorically speaking, the equations blow up. So you have one thing that sort of works in one area, another thing that works in another
Mm,
area, but there's nothing that unifies them. In other words, we don't understand what is going on in physics. And clearly, at the level of microbiology and cell biology, we don't really understand what's going on. People are mixing things in test tubes. And that's another important point. A lot of what goes on in cell biology, this is happening in a lab, whereas what happens in a human body might be very different in a much more complex environment with all the different variables in the human body. And they're trying to extrapolate based on things in test tubes. There's just so many problems with the way modern science and just modern society is working and not acknowledging all of the pitfalls. The response I get is, but Mark, we're never going to be perfect and it's good enough the way it is. And my response is, no, it's not good enough. We're not even close to understanding why people get sick. Even if you adopt the virus model, why do some people get sick at the party and others don't? Why do people have different symptoms? Why do some people respond to certain
mm,
medications and not other ones? Why is there's this 96% that's missing and why can't we reconcile the equations? We could go on and on. The fundamentals are not there. And that's why there are so many quote unquote anomalies, things that don't fit the model, because the model's not right in
mm,
basically every area of inquiry.
mm. I think I mentioned this before in the show, but I just want to, because it's a perfect example. Because I live in Australia and we get a lot of sun, and there's been this ongoing scare campaign around the sun and skin cancer, and it's presented as black and white. Sun is
Mm-hmm.
bad, you know, rub these petrochemicals all over your skin, which we all know are carcinogenic. I've looked into this in particular quite in depth, and it was just on the Australia Skin Council site. They had this big headline saying, now beyond a shadow of a doubt, sun causes cancer. Here's the study. So I love looking at studies because you just need a little bit of a brain to, as you said, to understand the methodology of how the study was structured to pull it apart quite simply.
Yeah.
And it was I can't remember, 20-year study, and it was all the two categories were people who used sunscreen and people who didn't use sunscreen. So the people who used sunscreen got fewer cancers than those who didn't. What wasn't accounted for was stress, diet, times of exposure. Were you under blue, as we know now, blue light can cause the melanomas. Were you under blue light? And even conscientiousness, because if you're the kind of person who applies sunscreen, does it mean other areas of your life you're far more conscientious about your health than someone who just doesn't, free wheels it in all areas of their life? So what the mind-blowing thing for me is like, how you're not an idiot. How do you not? You can't just, that's not how you measure anything. You need to get as many causal factors as possible and then pass them as best as possible to try and get to some sort of element of truth. And it's just, and as you've outlined, it's just like we're doing this in almost every area of what is important to us to be a human being, because it does take more work. It's more complicated. It's more nuanced. It's going to take more time, but ultimately what in your life that is beneficial long-term has come easily from little effort or badly structured thinking.
Right.
Yeah.
This requires energy, mental energy to consider. I think the technical term in statistics is the confounding variables, the other variables that might be affecting the results beyond the thing that we're thinking of. And we see this everywhere in every discipline where we observe something, we jump to a causal model for why it happened, and we forget all the other possible variables that could be related to it. We see this with climate. This is a huge one where there's one narrow narrative.
When's
CO2.
That book coming out? Yeah, when's that book coming? Are you working on one of that? That's going to be fun for you.
I have a full chapter on it actually in An End to the Upside Down Reset.
Yeah.
So I have addressed it.
I haven't read that yet. But that's definitely a book in and of itself, because that is so profoundly complicated, the environment. And when you speak to people, it's unbelievable how just even bringing it up is sacrilege that you'd even question it.
It is. That's why.
Don't you know that 99% of all scientists agree that climate change is entirely man-made? You're like, whoa. Have you looked at any geological records in your
Well, it's another logical fallacy. Appeal to consensus, as if that is a substitute for scientific evidence.
That'll be fun doing that one, because that's like the sake. I guess it's becoming less of the sacred cow, and it's not to say I am all for finding more effective, cleaner forms of energy that don't exploit people or the planet. We're all for that, but if you're just making, as you've said, if you're just making these assumptions, all it's leading is to totalitarianism, because the people who are forcing those assumptions down your throat are making huge amounts of money off it.
Yeah. It seems to be a cover. In my book, An End to the Upside Down Reset, I quoted elements of the Green New Deal, which is supposed to be this environmental initiative. And when you look at the text, all of a sudden it introduces these social policies that are basically like DEI and what you might call woke. Has nothing to do with climate. What's going on here? So it's a way of trying to control behavior. There was an interview that I referenced in my book. This was from Project Veritas. Not an interview, but it was a candid footage of a CNN technical director. He didn't know he was being filmed, but he was talking in 2021 about how fear sells. And that at the time when COVID was really hot, that's what everyone was thinking about. He said, COVID's going to die down. But what's coming next is the climate scare. And that one has longevity. And he was very much right about that. Because in 2021, we weren't hearing as much about climate. The minute COVID died down, all of a sudden, climate change as an existential threat, human caused. We have to restrict human behavior. Don't travel as much. Change what you eat, and so forth.
Yeah. I just want to I'm conscious of your time. I do want to touch upon. I want to leave people with just a better way in terms of how they can make sense of reality in your estimation and what you've applied to be successful in your life. But before we do that, I just really want to hear quickly about. We've seen all the UAPs. I'd rather call them UFOs that have been that phenomena, and as we call them, aliens, interdimensional beings. You've written a book on it. What's
Mhm.
just give a very quick for people who think it's crazy. Like, what is the science and research telling us about this?
I would start by saying it's an incredibly complex issue. To simplify it in any direction
Okay.
is
Yeah.
missing the core point of it. And often what we hear about it on the news, we hear about a craft, and that's definitely important. But consciousness is an essential element to this
Mm.
because many experiences of contact with non-human intelligence, whether it has to do with the UFO or otherwise, deals with some kind of otherworldly experience where people are encountering entities in some other dimension,
Mm.
whether it's through a near-death experience or psychedelics or many other forms that I go through in the book in detail. And you enter a world of such strangeness that it's very difficult to wrap one's mind around what's actually going on. Um, I want to quote Linda Moulton Howe. I'm paraphrasing what she said. She says something like, it's a house of mirrors with quicksand as the floor. Something like that. When you try
sounds
to grasp what's
sounds
going
like
on.
my love life, Mark. Sorry, bad joke.
Yeah.
So, well,
Yeah.
that's the particularly with them. How do you make sense? Because that's I've sort of because I've had psilocybin experiences and also meditative experiences where I've communicated with, however you want to word it, like interdimensional beings, or I've had clear guidance from some factor that I can feel is not coming from my. It's very difficult to language. I want to say consciousness, but maybe it is. But the more I've looked into this, the more I feel like when we call something alien or extraterrestrial, it's just something that's always existing, but it's in a dimension that we can't perceive due to our own consciousness not being there. And then when you read a lot of the Eastern texts and the mystics, and they're talking about being able to perceive these things. It's like that famous, I can't remember which guru it was, but they gave him, it was when back in the 60s and they was taking a lot of acid, and they gave him acid, and he just goes, nothing's changed. Like
Mm-hmm.
he was already into the dimension that these people are mind blown about. But then, so there's that. But I also feel then, what's say this more difficult to say an objective reality, but say when people are, there's all these reports of things in the sky. And I would assume if you have the ability to travel through vast distances of space and all of that, you could easily cloak your you could easily cloak a ship, for example, if you're doing that. I would assume if you have that technology. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like what's going on then with this, with everyone seeing this stuff now?
I think each case needs to be evaluated independently because
Independently.
there
Okay.
are
Yeah.
instances of government technologies that might be way more advanced than we realize. There
Yeah.
could be other explanations that don't invoke any interdimensional intelligence. So that's what I would say is each one's distinct and we have to look at the evidence there. And it could, this stuff might just not be within our comprehension. And you could have crafts that could go in and out of dimensions. Why they would have to come into this dimension, we don't know. Some people believe that they're trying to give us hints, these intelligences, but there's so much that's in the realm
Mm.
of speculation here. My book, An End to Upside Down Contact, attempts to introduce many of these ideas so that people at least have a framework with which to evaluate when something happens in the news. But it starts with acknowledging the importance of consciousness in all this, and that we're dealing with interdimensional things, and that the physical parts of it and the physical craft, it's a tiny piece of a much bigger puzzle.
Mm. What do you think of Graham Hancock's work, just quickly, on his foundation of thinking that we've all the lineage of
Really interesting
yeah
stuff. I'm now starting to ask different questions about history, given my work on cosmology, my book, An End to the Upside Down
yeah
Cosmos. And I really don't, I don't think whatever we're told, whatever the history books tell us, I'm sure there's something wrong with it, but I don't know
mm.
exactly what's right. And there's a
yeah
growing movement of people who are not just talking about this, the Younger Dryas event that Graham Hancock has spoken of, I don't know, like roughly 10,000 years ago, there was a major cataclysm. But people are speaking about a societal reset that might have occurred as like in the 1700s, where we had advanced human technology, and many of the buildings we see like in Europe and all
uh,
over the place, these might be free energy technologies
yeah
that are remnants of an old civilization that was essentially wiped out. And there were world's fairs which repopulated with many orphans, but also re-educated society. I'm not claiming that I know what's true in any of this, but
mm.
that's not some, these are like kind of distinct categories of people who
Mm.
question history. I don't
Mm.
know what's true, but I do think We need to question whatever narrative we've been told. Even from a more just traditional perspective, look at what goes on in the news, where the mainstream narrative will completely mischaracterize something, and that could end up in a history book.
Mm,
Imagine things that were happening longer ago, and we're trying
mm,
to guess what happened
yeah.
a long time. Even if we use science, for example, to try to guess things, I'm more skeptical of the tools that we're using, that we could be fooled and misunderstand geology, for example.
Mm. It's very. I was for many years a photographer, and when I started my career out, I was working for one of the main newspapers here in Australia, doing. And you'd go and to obviously get. I'd be getting some shots of whatever was happening, and I went to an event of at the time it was a controversial artist who'd used younger adults uh, for his beautiful works, and that'd always be. And it was a big controversy at the time about, and probably even more so now, of the appropriateness of using naked teenagers in artwork. Even though if you look at the artwork, for me, there's absolutely nothing sexual about it whatsoever. It's just, it's Renaissance art.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to hear him talk at the time when he was under attack. And the way I listened, and he gave this beautifully articulate 45-minute talk about his work, addressing some of the criticisms. And it was completely reasonable. I'm like, anyone who heard that would think, okay, great. Well, you pretty much closed the chapter for me on who he was and what the work was. And then the next day in the paper, it was like, can't remember, 300 words, little article, third page. Uh, and it was the absolute opposite of what he said. I'm not saying just to surprise you, but it was so far removed, and it was and it was also, unless you gave him fair due and gave it a good 4 or 5 page analysis on what he actually said, and didn't strongman his arguments, and then you can still have a view which differs, but at least you made an attempt to understand. And I was quite, I can't remember, I would have been in my early 20s at the time. I was already a bit cynical, but I was like, oh my God. That's when I just completely tuned out of any media whatsoever, even alternate media now, because it's like what I heard with my direct. It's like when someone tells you something about a country and you go there and you've been told all these people are this and they're that, and it's a dangerous country, and you go there and you're like, these are some of the loveliest people I've ever met. And it's also probably to do with how consciousness, how open your heart is, and how you are with other people, and you're getting that mirrored back to you. But it's hilarious. It's not hilarious. It's kind of terrifying that people are making sense of the world based off, even more than edible, because our minds have been completely addled by social media or TikTok. They'll hear one thing or read one thing, whatever that topic is, and that's it. And you're like, so on that, sorry, that's more of a statement and a question, but on that, what is just to finish with, what are there just some very basic principles that you can give people to help them think more clearly about these? And we're all short on time, so I guess apply it to the things which matter to you most.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that comes to mind. So, like I said, I have a very mainstream background, so I know a lot of people who are extremely intelligent intellectually, but will
Mm,
say things like, "Mark, that can't be true because the majority of scientists are saying the opposite."
mm,
And I'm not a scientist, and they say it's true. So obviously, we have to trust them. It's like
mm,
turn your brain
mm,
off, just
mm,
trust the authorities, and that might be the number one thing to do, is to always question and not to believe someone just because they have a lot of experience. And you could have people who are very smart and they are experts in their field, but doesn't mean
mm,
they're 100% right about everything.
mm,
Everyone is due to be questioned because human beings make errors. I think that's where we've got to start. And I mean, I'm thinking about it practically. So many people in my world who are locked into these narratives, the mainstream narratives, in spite of their intelligence. What does one do? And I'm at the point now where I'm much less interested actually in trying to shift other people's opinions. I mean,
mm.
I love doing talks like this and writing
Yeah.
books and putting things out there, but it's sort of a passive way of doing it because we put the information out. They can take it if they want, but if they're not ready, there's no forcing anyone.
Mm,
That's what I found.
mm. In terms of, so I guess it's, look, the surmise, if you're really, and it's something I've applied to my own life, if it's not something I'm going to invest the time and energy into delving deeply into, because they're and actually trying to really understand what's going on, and looking at all different sides of the argument and then forming some sort of thesis, I just don't have an opinion. I just keep quiet. And I think that's really hard because everyone these days feel like they need to talk or have a view on something, and there's so much information. But really, any number of topics you could spend a decade on and still be grazing around the perimeter.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's in many ways how I feel, in that I don't know I don't think I believe anything.
Mm.
I
Mm.
have degrees of probability
Yeah.
where I think this is more likely to be true than that. But even with the virus issue, for example, it is literally impossible to prove a negative, to
Mm.
prove that there is no virus. You can't prove a negative.
Mm.
We can just get closer to the truth by showing fallacies. So I think there are certain areas that, and I have to be really careful because I'm speaking publicly. And if there's an area like we're talking about genetics today, I was trying to caveat that by saying this is an area to look into and hopefully expose your audience to new areas of questioning. But to express, I really don't know, and I haven't looked into this enough. So to give the appropriate caveats where
Mm.
we don't know, and sometimes I'm asked questions, and I also just say that's not I can't opine on that because I haven't done enough research on it. And other things I can opine on it and give different angles, but still not know for sure. So
Mm.
it's like really getting clear on what is it that we know for sure. And where I've landed is there's one thing I know for sure, which is that right now it feels like I'm having a conscious experience, and literally everything else is some form of an inference, including the past, because the past is a memory that I have right now, and it seems like it was really real. It's in my memory, but the memory occurs in the present moment.
Mm.
I can't prove the past, let alone proving these other things that we're talking about in a reality that might be way more mystical than we could ever imagine. So it's like trying to hold on to the concreteness of pieces of evidence and logic, and then also having the backdrop of knowing that we live in a very mysterious place.
It's attach instead of attach your sense of worth and your identity as someone who is inquisitive and questions as opposed to someone who needs to know and be proven to be right, because one will keep you endlessly expanding your consciousness and the other one will just shut you down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mark, thank you. Thank you so much. I absolutely I adore your work and everything you're doing. And I know you're reaching a lot of people, and it's, as you said before the show off camera, it's really exciting times. What's happening in this space? That there's more and more people interested in, more and more people are seeing the cracks in these sort of dominant narratives than ever. And ultimately, I think it leads to people being more self reliant and being their own light rather than someone else tell them what reality is.
Yep, I
Yeah.
agree. There's a lot of reason for optimism. And I thank you for having me on the show and for having the courage to address topics like this, which are
Uh,
very controversial these days.
there's no other path. Once you start. Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much.
Thanks.